Hello coders, and thanks for joining us for another Renaissance Coders tutorial. My name is Darren, and today we're going to be talking about shaders in Unity 3D. So we're going to talk about what shaders are, some things that shaders can do, and then in the end of this tutorial I'll go ahead and provide some examples of how you can manipulate shaders on your materials inside of Unity. Alright, so what are shaders? Well, shaders are tiny little scripts or programs. I say tiny, but sometimes they can be quite large. But they utilize object, vertex, and texture coordinate information to modify the way materials appear on game objects, or they modify the way that objects are rendered in your game. Now, some shaders can allow you to see through parts of your game objects. This is a transparency shader. And some shaders can make your game object reflective of its environment, otherwise known as a reflective shader. And then for the most part, you'll be using shaders that are just regular diffuse shaders, which give you sort of this drop-off shadow on your materials or on your objects, or you'll be using a specular shader, which will allow you to see light reflected off of your object, which changes based on the angle that you're looking at your object from. So these are some of the most common shaders. There are literally an infinite amount of shaders that you can add to your objects, though. And shaders will use color information and manipulation to pull off basically any effect you want your game objects to use. Alright, so I've seen a lot of different types of shaders. Shaders can do things like create holographic effects. They can do silly things where they just invert your color information. So if you imagine a shader could essentially do something like this, where it'll look at your pixel color information, and for every red pixel, it'll change that color to blue. But that's something that shaders are capable of doing on a very low level. All right, so how do shaders work? Well, this is a very complex topic, but I'll give you guys a high overview. Shaders will use a combination of a lot of different elements that you feed to it to give you the result that you want. So it'll take in texture, UV coordinate information, object vertex or pixel information, and even scene lighting information from around your game objects. And it'll use that sort of information inside math functions to manipulate the way objects are rendered in the scene. Alright, so it takes in all that information, and this is very low level information, which is why there's not a lot of shader programmers out there. But shader programming is actually really easy once you understand how everything works. Alright, so let's jump into Unity and see how we can actually access these different shaders. Alright, so here I have 3 cubes that we're going to be looking at, all with different materials and different shaders, and we'll be talking about a couple of these for the next couple of minutes. So here's my first cube, this sort of red cube, and this is using the standard shader. This is just a regular old shader. You could say that this is the diffuse shader. This is one of the most common shaders you're going to be using. If you look at check out the little red ball here, which describes your material. I'll zoom in on that a little bit more. And you can see how it starts off with sort of red in the top left corner. And as you come down to the top right, you have this drop-off shadow. That is diffuse. That's what diffuse is. So you'll have light on your object, and you also have shadow on your object. Okay, so that is the regular diffuse shader. As I showed in the previous tutorial on materials, you can add different textures to it, and it's still going to be that base diffuse. You can change the color of it from here. You can do a lot of different manipulations to the shader. So this is the material shader interaction, where the material gives you access to the shader settings, so you can manipulate it based on different shader functions within that shader. Alright, and again, if you haven't seen the materials overview, go ahead and check out that tutorial. I will provide a link to it in the top right corner of the screen. Alright, so this is the first shader, again, the most basic. Here we have what is called a Toon Shader, where you have this sort of outline of your object. From whatever angle you're looking at it from, you'll always have this outline. This is something similar to what Borderlands does. If you ever played that game, they'll outline their objects like this. It's very subtle, but it does look very toony. The Toon Shader isn't defined by that outline, though. We can actually go to our shader selection here. So let's actually select a new shader. We can come down to Toon, and you can just see the wide variety of selection that we have here. And instead of basic outline, I'll select basic. And so here we don't have an outline, but this is still a Toon Shader. And the best way I could describe the Toon Shader is that you're dealing with just flat color. You don't, if you look in at this sphere here, you don't have any sort of drop-off shadow. There's no concept of depth really on your Toon Shader. So it just looks sort of cartoony. All right, and our third shader that we're going to talk about in this tutorial is going to be a cutout or a fade or transparency, whatever you really want to call it. This isn't really a fade, this is a cutout. What it'll do is it'll take your texture. So here you can see I added a texture to it. And this is coming from Unity's assets. Now what I did was I selected a texture that had some alpha transparency. So you can see in some of these textures that there's no alpha. It's just straight color, but in this particular texture you can see basically from where the arrow is, there's no color information there. That is the alpha. And so what cutout does is it'll look for the alpha and it won't draw anything. It'll just be transparent. And so that's why we have this ability to sort of look through the cube. And I should reiterate that this is a cube. If I change the alpha cutoff, so you can see this alpha cutoff setting, and it basically determines where we're going to be cutting the alpha off at. And if I bring that all the way down, you can see that this is what the object would look like with that texture on it if it wasn't a transparent or cutout shader. So you can see it's definitely a box, but if I bring that alpha cutoff up, you can actually begin to see through the object. Okay, and this is a pretty cool shader that would possibly look good on some sort of futuristic rotating sign. Yeah, that looks like it could work well for something like that. But the whole point is you can have this whole host of different shaders that you can use. These legacy shaders where you can add reflective properties to it to where it'll actually reflect the environment, and then just diffuse, bump diffuse is where you can actually add normals. And what defines each one of these shaders is the settings that go along with it. So I'll choose FX Flare, and you can see that the settings here completely change. It only allows me to put in only one texture there. If I go back to the standard, you can see, and this is why Unity 5 is so great, because they give us the shader that allows us to have all of these different settings. So for the most part, you actually won't be straying too far away from the standard shader if you're using Unity 5. Alright, so that was the overview on shaders. That's going to conclude this tutorial. I hope you guys learned a lot. If you guys want more in-depth information about shaders, or you guys just want to know how to script shaders, let me know in the comment section below. If I get enough requests from there, then I will think about doing a shader scripting tutorial series, which might not come out until around August or September. But let me know if you guys want to see that. If you like this tutorial, again, drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.